The beam of the guard's flashlight was a solid thing, a blade of sickly yellow light that cut through the chemical haze and swept across the grimy floor. It passed so close to the toe of her boot that Captain Eva Rostova could almost feel the heat of the bulb through the leather. She froze, every muscle in her body locking into absolute stillness. Her heart was a frantic, caged bird beating against her ribs, a drumbeat of pure terror she was certain the entire complex could hear. She had pressed herself into a shallow service trench, a mere depression in the concrete floor hidden beneath a labyrinth of groaning, dripping pipes. One cough, one nervous rattle from the demolitions kit strapped to her chest, one misplaced breath that fogged in the chill air, and it was all over. The enemy guard's boots scuffed against the concrete, the sound unnaturally loud in the cavernous reactor hall. He paused, his silhouette a hulking shadow against the dim emergency lighting. He was close enough that she could smell the stale tobacco on his uniform. Then he began to hum. It was a simple, off-key tune, something she vaguely recognized from a pop song played on the radio a lifetime ago. The mundane normalcy of it was more terrifying than any shouted order or barked alert. This was just a man, bored on his patrol, utterly unaware that the woman who would bring his world down around his ears was hiding inches away. Eva held her breath until spots danced at the edge of her vision. The final, unarmed, shaped charge in her hand felt like a lead weight, a block of plastique and circuitry that held the power of life and death. This moment, this paralyzing proximity, was not in the mission brief. The file, stamped top secret, had spoken of predictable patrol patterns and 10-minute windows. It had said nothing of this nerve-shredding, intimate dance with the enemy. Her mind, against her will, flashed to the briefing room. It was only 24 hours ago, but it felt like a different epoch. The room was sterile, smelling of filtered air and coffee. The mission parameters were clear, delivered in the calm, monotone voice of the intelligence officer. Demolish the primary catalytic cracking tower at the Krimsk Industrial Complex. Cripple their chemical weapons program. Setback estimated at 18 months. The words were clean, clinical. But for Eva, the real objective had been hovering in the room like a ghost. A grainy black-and-white surveillance photo lay on the polished table. It showed a younger, sharper version of her father, General Anatoly Rostov, standing before the gates of this very complex during a tense border conflict decades ago. His voice, even in memory, was a cold, hard echo in her mind. Sentiment gets soldiers killed, Eva. This is a job for cold, hard clarity. It is not a place for proving yourself. The guard's humming stopped. He shifted his weight, his rifle strap creaking. Eva's finger tightened imperceptibly on the charge. If he discovered her, this would be her only weapon. A blunt object, a final futile act of defiance. She could see the wear on the heel of his boot, a patch of smooth leather where the tread had been worn away by countless monotonous laps of this facility. She saw the faint plume of his breath in the frigid air. He was not a faceless enemy in that moment. He was a man, tired, probably thinking of his own bunk and a warm meal. The humanity of it was a sudden sharp pain in her chest. This was the part her father's calculus, his Cold War strategies and clean maps with red and blue arrows, never accounted for. The space between heartbeats, the shared fragile humanity that existed even here, in the belly of the beast. Then, as suddenly as he had stopped, he moved on. His footsteps receded, the beam of his flashlight bobbing away to probe another shadowy corner. The immediate danger passed, leaving in its wake a trembling void in Eva's nerves. She did not allow herself a sigh of relief. There was no time. She exhaled slowly, silently, forcing the air out through her nose, forcing the fear out with it. The window was closing. She had to move. Now. With a precision born of countless hours of training, she began to arm the charge, her fingers, numb with cold and adrenaline, finding the familiar switches and connections by touch alone. The mission was no longer an abstract objective in a briefing file. It was here, in her hands, in the terrifying silence after the guard's footsteps faded away. The silence after the guard's footsteps faded was more terrifying than his presence. It was a vacuum, waiting to be filled by the next sound, the next threat. Eva remained frozen for a full 30 seconds, her ears straining against the hum of the complex. Only when she was certain he was truly gone did she allow her muscles to unlock. A single, controlled breath escaped her lips, a faint plume in the chill air. The shaped charge was now live, a dormant beast clinging to the steel pillar. She had 15 minutes. Her mind, treacherous and exhausted, did not focus on the exfiltration route or the next phase of the demolition. It hurtled her back, not to the briefing room, but to a sun-drenched afternoon a lifetime ago. She was 12, standing at rigid attention in the sprawling garden of her father's dacha. Her small frame was swallowed by a custom-made junior officer's uniform, a birthday gift from the general. He stood before her, a monolith of starched green cloth and polished brass. "Posture, Yevgenia," he had said, using her formal name like a weapon. His own posture was a lesson in geometry, unyielding and perfect. A slouch is a sign of a weak spirit. Chin up, shoulders back. Let me see your salute. She had snapped her hand to her brow, her fingers pressed together, her arm at the perfect angle. She held it, her heart swelling with a desperate need for approval. He circled her, his eyes missing nothing. The summer sun was warm on her neck. "The wrist is soft," he declared, his voice flat. He stepped forward and tapped her forearm with his swagger stick. Not a strike, but a correction, a dismissal. It lacks intention. A salute is not a wave. It is a statement. It says, I am a part of this. I am disciplined. I am worthy. Again. She had saluted again, her arm trembling with the effort of holding it perfectly still. He looked at her for a long, silent moment, his expression unreadable. Then he simply nodded, a curt, almost imperceptible dip of his chin. Adequate. He turned and walked back toward the house, leaving her standing alone in the sun, her arm still frozen in place. The word adequate echoing in the space where proud should have been. That memory was a ghost that haunted every mission, every test. She hadn't joined the military to follow in his footsteps. She had joined to escape his shadow, to find a version of herself he could not measure with a swagger stick. She had chosen the engineers, the sappers, the builders and breakers. She found a grim poetry in using mathematics and physics to shape the world, to create bridges from nothing or reduce fortresses to rubble. She discovered she had a gift for it, a cool, analytical mind that could calculate load-bearing points and explosive yields under pressure. Her commanding officers saw a brilliant tactical mind. Her father, when he bothered to notice, saw only that she had chosen a technical trade. He acknowledged her proficiency the way he might acknowledge a well-functioning piece of equipment. It was not courage in his eyes. It was merely function. Another sound, the distant clang of a metal door, snapped her back to the present. The Krimsk complex was stirring. She had to move. Pushing off from the pillar, she became a shadow once more, flitting between hulking machinery and snaking conduits. The memory of her father's dismissive gaze was now a fuel. It burned away the last remnants of fear, replacing it with a cold, focused resolve. This was not just about crippling a weapons program. This was about proving once and for all that worth was not given in a quiet garden. It was taken in the roaring fire of a mission accomplished. She checked the digital timer on her wrist. 14 minutes. The countdown had begun. The memory of her father's cold, assessing eyes faded, replaced by the immediate, metallic taste of fear. 14 minutes. The number glowed on her wrist display, a silent digital heartbeat counting down to 0. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to flee this cavernous tomb before it became her own. But the mission was only half done. The primary charges were set, but the secondary triggers, the devices that would ensure the chain reaction would be unstoppable, still needed to be placed at the far end of the hall. It was a calculated risk the briefing had deemed essential. Total destruction required multiple points of failure. She moved, a phantom weaving through a forest of steel. The world narrowed to the next 5 feet, then the next. The hum of the complex was a living thing, a constant, deep-throated vibration she felt in her teeth. It masked her footsteps, but it also masked the sounds of anyone approaching. A bead of sweat traced a path through the grime on her temple, but she dared not wipe it away. Her hands, encased in thin tactical gloves, were steady. They were a soldier's hands now, not a daughter's. They knew their business. Her path took her past a control station, its panels dark and silent for the night shift. A framed photograph sat on the desk, tilted toward the empty chair. In the gloom, she could make out the figures. The guard she had just evaded, his face split by a genuine, unguarded smile, his arm around a beaming woman, a small child perched on his shoulders. The image was a punch to the gut. It was a life, a family. This complex was not just a target. It was a paycheck. It was a school uniform for that child, food on that family's table. The clinical objective of the briefing, cripple their weapons program, shattered against the reality of that simple, happy photograph. This was the war her father never understood. He fought against flags and ideologies on a map. She fought in the space between men, in the awful, intimate calculus of knowing that every action, every explosion ripped through the fabric of ordinary lives. The guard was no longer just a target. He was a father, a husband, and she was the monster in the shadows coming to destroy his world. A wave of nausea threatened to overwhelm her. Was this the clarity he spoke of? This sickening feeling of being both judge and executioner? She tore her eyes away from the photograph. Sentiment gets soldiers killed. His words were a poison, but they were also an anchor in this storm of doubt. She could not think of the family in the picture. She had to think of the families in the villages downwind, the ones who would cough blood and watch their children wither if the toxins brewed in this facility were ever deployed. It was a choice between one man's tragedy and 1,000. There was no right answer, only a terrible, necessary choice. Pushing the moral quagmire aside, she focused on the mechanics of the mission. She reached the secondary junction box, a rusty, unassuming metal cabinet bolted to the wall. This was the nervous system of her plan. Placing the final trigger charge here would make the demolition untraceable and irreversible. As she worked, her fingers automatically finding the correct wires, another sound filtered through the industrial hum. It was different this time. Not boots, not doors. It was a voice, young and laced with static, crackling from a radio she hadn't noticed further down the walkway. Nothing to report. Sector 7 is clear. A pause. Copy that, Control. Continuing patrol. I'll check the primary reactor feed before my break. The voice was coming closer. He was heading directly for her position. Eva's blood ran cold. She was out of hiding spots, exposed in the open near the junction box. She had mere seconds. The trigger was half-armed, its wires splayed open like a surgeon's patient on the table. To run now was to leave the mission half-finished, vulnerable to counter-demolition. To stay was to be discovered. The timer on her wrist read 12 minutes. The guard's footsteps began to echo, rhythmic and unhurried, on the metal gantry above her. He was almost directly overhead. The footsteps on the gantry above were a steady metallic drumbeat directly over her head. Each one vibrated through the structure, a countdown more terrifying than the one on her wrist. Ava pressed herself into the narrow space behind the junction box, her black uniform blending into the deep shadows. The trigger charge was a tangled mess of wires in her hand, only half connected. To finish it now would mean movement, the faintest click of components seating home. To leave it was to fail. She could hear the guards breathing now, a slight wheeze mixed with the rustle of his uniform. He stopped. The footsteps ceased. Her own breath froze in her lungs. Had he seen something? A scuff mark on the floor? The faint gleam of a buckle in the dim light? The silence stretched, thin and brittle. She imagined him raising his rifle, peering down into the darkness where she hid. This was it. This was the moment it would all end, not in a blaze of glory, but in a quiet, ignominious capture in a grimy corner. Then, the sound of a match striking. A brief sulfurous smell cut through the chemical air. He had merely stopped to light a cigarette. The relief was so potent it felt like a physical blow. She heard him take a long, deep drag, then exhale slowly. A plume of smoke drifted down, a ghostly wisp in the murky light. He began to hum again, the same aimless tune from before. He was bored, complacent. It was his routine. This was his normal. The wires in her hand felt like live serpents. 11 minutes. The calculus of the mission slammed back into the forefront of her mind. She had to finish this. It was a risk, but the greater risk was a partial demolition. Slowly, with a precision that felt like a prayer, she moved her hands. She didn't look. She worked by touch alone, her fingers remembering the training, the countless hours spent blindfolded in a simulated environment. One wire, its copper core stripped bare, needed to be twisted to its terminal. She moved it millimeter by agonizing millimeter. The guard's humming continued, a steady, oblivious drone. Her thumb found the small plastic connector. It needed to be pressed into its housing with a firm, definitive click. There was no way to muffle it. It was a sound that would slice through his humming like a gunshot. She hesitated, her thumb poised. This was the threshold. On one side was success, on the other discovery. She thought of the photograph, of the man's smiling face. She thought of the child on his shoulders. Then she thought of the briefing, of the satellite images of mass graves in a neighboring province, graves linked to the very weapons this place produced. The guard above her coughed, a harsh, wet sound that made her jump. He shuffled his feet, and for a terrifying second she thought he was leaning over the railing to look down. But he was just adjusting his stance. He resumed his humming, the tune trailing off. This was her only chance. She took a silent, steadying breath, poured every ounce of her focus into her thumb, and pressed. The click was deafening. It echoed in the confined space behind the junction box. A sharp metallic snick that seemed to hang in the air. The humming stopped. Instantly, the only sound was the hum of the complex. Ava's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, trapped animal. She could picture him up there, cigarette frozen halfway to his lips, his head cocked, listening. Had he heard it? Would he dismiss it as part of the complex's endless noise? Or would his training kick in? Seconds ticked by, each one an eternity. Then she heard the sound of his boots scraping against the metal gantry, not walking away. He was moving toward the ladder. He was coming down to investigate. The metallic creak of the ladder was a death knell. Each rung the guard descended was a hammer blow against Eva's nerves. He was no longer a bored man on patrol. He was a hunter who had caught a scent. The trigger charge was fully armed and hidden, but she was trapped. The space behind the junction box was a dead end, a shallow recess that offered concealment from a distance, but no escape from a close inspection. Her mind raced, discarding one hopeless option after another. A firefight would bring the entire complex down on her. Submission was not an option. His boots hit the concrete floor with a solid thud. She could see the shadow of his legs now, just around the corner of the box. He was moving slowly, cautiously. His rifle would be up, his finger on the trigger. The hum of the complex seemed to intensify, a roaring in her ears that drowned out everything but the sound of his approach. She flattened herself against the cold metal, making herself as small as possible. Her hand closed around the only weapon she could reach without making a sound, a heavy adjustable wrench left behind by a maintenance worker. It was crude, brutal, and utterly silent. He was there. She could hear his breathing, just on the other side of the metal cabinet. The beam of his flashlight stabbed into her hiding spot, sweeping across the pipes just above her head. It lingered, then moved down. In a second, it would illuminate her boots. There was no more time. This was no longer about the mission. It was about survival. As the light began to drop, she moved. It wasn't a thought, but a raw animal instinct. She burst from her hiding place not away from him, but directly into his space. The move was so sudden, so unexpected that he flinched, his rifle barrel dipping for a fraction of a second. That was all she needed. She swung the wrench in a short, vicious arc, aiming not for his head, but for the flashlight. The plastic and glass exploded in a shower of sparks and fragments, plunging the immediate area into near-total darkness. He grunted in shock and pain, stumbling backward. Ava didn't wait. She dropped the wrench and lunged forward, her hands finding the hot barrel of his rifle. She shoved it upward, twisting with all her strength. He was stronger, heavier, but she had the element of surprise and the desperate strength of a cornered animal. He fired. The gunshot was cataclysmic in the enclosed space. The muzzle flash a blinding strobe that illuminated his wide, startled eyes for a split second. The bullet ricocheted off a steel beam with a high-pitched whine. The sound of the shot would bring everyone. The mission timer was irrelevant now. She had maybe a minute, 2 at most, before the complex was swarming. She kneed him hard in the groin. His grip on the rifle loosened with a choked gasp. She yanked the weapon from his hands and threw it clattering into the darkness. She didn't want to kill him. She couldn't. The image of the photograph was seared into her mind. She turned to run, but his hand shot out, grabbing her ankle in a vice-like grip. He was pulling her down, shouting now, a raw, guttural cry of alarm. "Trevoga! Intruder!" Panic, cold and absolute, seized her. She kicked back blindly, her boot connecting with his face. She felt the crunch of cartilage, and his grip loosened. She scrambled free, surging to her feet and sprinting into the maze of machinery. Behind her, his shouts were joined by the blaring of a klaxon, a deafening, wailing siren that tore through the complex. Red emergency lights began to strobe, turning the cavernous hall into a nightmarish disco of light and shadow. The calm, calculated infiltration was over. Now it was a race against the sirens, against the converging boots, and against the relentless countdown on her wrist, which now read 9 minutes. She was a fox in a burning henhouse, and the hounds had been released. The world dissolved into a nightmare of sound and light. The klaxon was a physical force, a relentless, screaming wall of noise that pounded against her skull. The red emergency lights strobed, casting long, dancing shadows that twisted the familiar machinery into monstrous shapes. Every shadow now held a rifle. Every echo of the siren sounded like a shouted order. Ava ran, her boots pounding a frantic, desperate rhythm on the concrete floor. She was a ghost no longer. She was a target. Shouts echoed from multiple directions now, sharp and coordinated. They had her general location. The guards' cries had painted a bullseye on this sector. She could hear the pounding of boots converging, the sound amplified by the metal walkways and vast, empty spaces. Her original exfiltration route was a death trap. It would be swarming. She had to adapt, to think like the chaos itself. She ducked under a low-slung pipe, slid across a greasy maintenance platform, and squeezed through a narrow gap between 2 colossal distillation tanks. The air was thick with the smell of fear and chemicals. Her mind, usually a calm repository of maps and schematics, was a scramble. 8 minutes. The number on her wrist was a mocking reminder of the pyre she was building for herself. She was still deep inside the beast, and its immune system was now fully awake and hunting. A burst of automatic gunfire ripped through the air, shockingly loud even over the siren. Sparks erupted from a control panel 10 feet to her left. They were shooting at movement, at shadows. They didn't have a clear target yet, but they were saturating the area. She threw herself behind a stack of steel drums, her chest heaving. This was it. This was the sacrifice her father's cold calculus had always demanded. He spoke of it in the abstract. Acceptable losses. The cost of victory. He had never described the taste of it, the metallic tang of adrenaline and the sour burn of vomit in the back of the throat. He had never described the sheer, terrifying loneliness of being the one paying that cost. Another memory flashed unbidden, not of her father, but of her mother, a quiet woman with gentle hands and sad eyes, forever faded in the general's formidable shadow. The night before Eva left for the military academy, her mother had come to her room. She hadn't offered advice or empty platitudes. She had simply taken Eva's hand and pressed a small, smooth stone into her palm. It was a simple river stone, gray and unremarkable. "For courage," her mother had whispered, her voice barely audible. "It's just a stone," but it held its ground against the current for 1,000 years. Remember that. Eva had kept it, a silly secret talisman she carried in a small pocket of her gear. Her father would have scoffed at such sentimentality. Now huddled behind the drums as bullets whined off the metal around her, her fingers found the small, hard shape in her pocket. It was just a stone, but in that moment it was an anchor. It was a connection to a different kind of strength, a quiet, enduring resilience that had nothing to do with salutes or swagger sticks. It was the strength of her mother, waiting at home, the strength to hold her ground. The gunfire paused. They were reloading or advancing. This was her moment. She couldn't stay here. Peering around the drum, she saw a service hatch halfway down the wall, marked with faded Cyrillic letters she couldn't read. It was a chance, a gamble. It could lead to a dead end or straight into an enemy squad. But the open floor was certain death. With a final grounding touch of the stone, she pushed herself up and sprinted for the hatch. She expected to feel the searing impact of a bullet at any second. It didn't come. She reached the hatch, her fingers fumbling with the rusted latch. It was stiff, frozen in place. She threw her weight against it, desperation giving her strength. With a screech of protesting metal, it gave way. She pulled it open and plunged into the darkness beyond, just as another volley of gunfire chewed up the wall where she had been standing. She was in a narrow, pitch-black utility tunnel. The sounds of the hunt were muffled now, but they were still there. She had bought herself a few more minutes. The timer on her wrist read 7. The current was pulling hard, but for now, the stone was holding. The darkness in the utility tunnel was absolute. A thick, suffocating blanket that swallowed the blaring alarm and turned it into a dull, throbbing ache in her ears. Eva moved by touch alone, one hand trailing along the cold, damp wall, the other held out in front of her to ward off any unseen obstacles. The air was stale and thick with the smell of rust and damp earth. This was the complex's circulatory system, a place never meant for light or visitors. Her only guide was the faint, glowing numbers on her wrist. 6 minutes. She had to get out. Not just out of the tunnel, but out of the complex itself. The charges were set. The mission was a success, but only if she could create enough distance to survive the blast. The tunnel seemed to slope gently upward. She prayed it led to a peripheral building, a maintenance shed, anything but back into the main reactor hall. The memory of the guard's face, startled and then pained, flashed in the darkness. She pushed it away. There was no room for that now. There was only forward. After what felt like an eternity, a sliver of gray light appeared ahead. It was a door, outlined by the flashing red emergency lights from the other side. She approached with caution, her ear pressed against the cold metal. She could hear shouts, but they were distant, focused on the interior. This was her chance. She slowly, carefully turned the handle. It was unlocked. She cracked it open just enough to peer out. She was in a smaller secondary loading bay. Abandoned pallets and oil drums were stacked against the walls. At the far end, a large rolling door was shut, but a standard personnel door stood next to it, promising escape to the outside. The night air, cold and clean, whispered through the gap under the door. It was 30 feet of open space, 30 feet of exposure. She took a deep breath, gathering herself for the sprint. But as she prepared to move, a figure stepped out from behind a stack of crates, blocking her path to the door. It was a young soldier, barely more than a boy, his face pale and his rifle held with white-knuckled intensity. He was the one from the radio. He looked as terrified as she felt. His eyes were wide, darting from her blackened face to the demolitions kit still strapped to her chest. "Nedvigesha," he shouted, his voice cracking with fear and authority. "Don't move." Eva froze, her hand slowly rising. The timer read 5 minutes. A direct confrontation was a death sentence for them both. The blast would vaporize everything in this bay. She looked into his young, frightened eyes and saw the child from the photograph in the control room. She saw a life that hadn't even properly begun. "Listen to me," she said, her voice low and urgent, speaking in his language. "You need to run. This entire complex is going to blow. There are explosives everywhere. You have less than 5 minutes." He stared at her, confusion and doubt warring on his face. He was trained to see a monster, an enemy saboteur. Her words were a trick, a lie to save her own skin. He tightened his grip on the rifle, his finger hovering near the trigger. "Lies! Drop your weapon!" "I have no weapon," she said, her voice steady despite the frantic beating of her heart. She slowly gestured to the kit on her chest. "This is just the trigger. The charges are already set. I am not your enemy right now. The explosion is your enemy. Run, that way." She pointed away from the main complex, toward a row of smaller administrative buildings. "Tell everyone you see. Sound the general alarm. Save who you can." He hesitated, his eyes searching hers for the deceit. The klaxon continued to wail. 4 minutes. The ground seemed to tremble, or perhaps it was just her own body shaking. In that suspended moment, it was no longer a standoff between a soldier and a saboteur. It was a choice between duty and survival, between following orders and listening to reason. A shout came from deeper in the bay. Another guard was coming. The young soldier's eyes darted toward the sound, then back to Eva. The doubt in his eyes crystallized into a desperate, fearful decision. He lowered his rifle just an inch. It was all the opening she needed. She didn't wait for a second invitation. She broke into a full sprint, not toward him, but angling for the door. He didn't raise his rifle. He didn't shoot. He simply stared as she flew past him, a dark blur in the strobing red light. She hit the personnel door at a run, bursting out into the blessedly cold, open air. The night sky was vast and clear above her. She didn't look back. She just ran, her legs pumping, driving her away from the complex, toward the tree line and the extraction point that now felt a world away. Behind her, she heard the young soldier begin to shout, his voice rising in a genuine, panicked alarm. Trevoga! Evakuacja! Vzriv! He was saving who he could. She had given him that chance. The stone in her pocket felt heavy, a grounding weight as she fled the inferno she had created. The timer on her wrist blinked. 3 minutes. The world erupted behind her. It was not a single sound, but a symphony of annihilation. First came a deep, gut-wrenching thump that hit her in the chest, knocking the air from her lungs and throwing her to the frozen ground. Then a roar, a tearing, screaming roar as the complex tore itself apart. A wave of heat, dry and furious, washed over her, carrying the smell of scorched metal and vaporized chemicals. The night sky was banished, replaced by a false, churning dawn of orange and red. Chunks of twisted steel and concrete rained down around her, thudding into the earth like hellish hail. She curled into a ball, her hands over her head, as the shock wave rolled over the landscape, shaking the very bones of the earth. Then, as quickly as it began, the cacophony subsided, replaced by a ringing silence and the crackle of 1,000 fires. Ava pushed herself up, her ears numb, her body trembling with adrenaline and shock. She turned and looked back. Where the Krimsk industrial complex had stood, there was now a jagged silhouette against a wall of flame. The primary reactor was gone, collapsed into a smoldering crater. The secondary buildings were skeletal, burning husks. She had done it. The mission was an overwhelming, terrifying success. She stumbled the rest of the way to the extraction point, a designated clearing a kilometer away. The helicopter was already there, its rotors beating the smoky air, a beautiful mechanical angel of deliverance. Sergeant Petrov, her second-in-command, hauled her aboard, his face a mask of relief. "We thought we lost you, Captain," he shouted over the engine's whine. She just collapsed onto the webbed seating, unable to speak, her body vibrating with the aftershocks of the blast and the run. Days later, she stood in the same sterile briefing room. The same men were there, the maps now updated with before and after satellite imagery. The success of the operation was undeniable. The general was there at the head of the table, his posture as rigid as ever. He spoke, his voice devoid of any emotion, detailing the strategic setback to the enemy, the estimated years of recovery. He concluded by looking directly at her. Captain Rostova's execution of the demolition protocol was textbook, a commendable performance. The words were there. The recognition she had spent a lifetime craving was finally offered. But as she looked at him, at the cold approval in his eyes, she felt nothing. No pride, no vindication. His commendable performance was a world away from the gut-wrenching fear, the moral agony, the face of the young soldier she had spared. He was praising the destruction. He had no concept of the cost. The formal ceremony came next. A stage, a flag, a senior officer pinning a medal to her chest. He shook her hand, a firm, dry grip. She saluted, her wrist straight, her fingers tight, the perfect picture of a soldier. The cameras flashed. But her eyes were not on the general or the camera. They were on Sergeant Petrov and the rest of her team, standing at attention in the front row. They were the ones who had waited in the freezing dark. They were the ones who knew the weight of the silence on the comms. As she held her salute, Petrov gave her the slightest of nods, his eyes holding a respect that went deeper than any medal. Later, alone in her quarters, she took the river stone from her pocket. It was still just a smooth gray stone, but it held the memory of her mother's quiet strength, a strength that had nothing to do with explosions or tactics. It was the strength to endure, to hold on to one's humanity in the midst of hell. She placed it back in her pocket, next to the new weight of the medal. The general's recognition was a trophy, an empty piece of metal, but the stone and the silent nod from her team were real. She had not proven herself to her father. In the roaring fire of the Krimsk complex, that need had been burned away. She had finally and completely become her own woman.